بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وبعد. First of all, about the topic of the series, many brothers, they chose ulum al-Qur'an when we asked which you prefer, hadith or usul al-fiqh or Qur'an. Many brothers chose ulum al-Qur'an. When I talked to some of them, what they understood from ulum al-Qur'an was ulum al-Tafseer, and what they wanted. Some of them that I talked to, they said they wanted ulum al-Tafseer. Some of them also, the next topic that we would have discussed in usul al-fiqh, if we continued usul al-fiqh, has to do with lugha or language, or the tafsir al-nusus, how to understand the text and what are the principles related to the text. That's also a topic that some of the brothers wanted. They will have to wait for that, since those same brothers said they wanted ulum al-tafsir. So we'll start with aspects of, and today inshallah we'll have some introductory points, and then we'll talk about the methodology of tafsir, as well as the history of tafsir and different types of tafsir, and what are the requirements for the one who makes tafsir. And we may talk a little bit about the tafsir of the Ahl al-Bid'ah. We only have 8 meetings actually, so we may not cover all these topics, and inshallah maybe the last 2 will begin at least some aspects of tafsir al-nusus. First of all, the first topic to discuss actually is the place of tafsir. And why is the science of tafsir itself very important? Why should we be concerned about it? Why should we take the time to study it? First of all, because the honor of the science, or how important the science, of course, is related to or depends on how important is the topic that the science covers. Ulum al-Tafsir is really the study of the explanation of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the science that is devoted to trying to understand and grasp the meaning of the Qur'an and the meaning of the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So first of all, tafsir, what we are studying itself is a very important or noble topic. We're actually discussing or studying the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Secondly, of course, the Qur'an was meant to be applied. It was not meant simply to be read or even just to look at it. And the Qur'an was to be applied. And in order to know how to apply it, you have to know how to understand it. And first you have to know how to understand it. Which is what, again, basically this is what the tafsir is all about. How to understand it. This is, as I said, the essential aspect of tafsir, and with respect to the Qur'an, we want to be able to apply the Qur'an and know how to apply it. We know that through the principles of tafsir. As I said, it's very important that we don't just read the Qur'an. Many people read the Qur'an, they never take the time to understand it and understand its principles. This is something actually that goes against the practice of the Salaf, against the practice of the Sahaba. The Sahaba, as some of them said, they used to read 10 verses, and they would not go beyond those 10 verses until they understood them and they applied them. One of the Tabi'een, Sa'id ibn Jubair, he said, whoever recites the Qur'an and does not explain it or try to understand it, then he is like an ignorant person. And he is just reading something, and in fact he doesn't know really what it means. Another one of the Salaf, and he's pointing out the importance of the science of tafsir. He said the example of a people who recite the Qur'an and do not know its explanation is like a group of people who have a written message from their king that comes to them during the night, and they do not have a lamp. Therefore they do not know what is in the message. And the example of the one who knows the tafsir is like the person who comes to them with a lamp and reads to them the message. And this is what basically tafsir is all about. And trying to figure out the science of tafsir is showing us and explaining to us how to figure out or how to understand the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore after we understand it we'll be able to apply it properly. Before we get into really some aspects of tafsir and what tafsir is all about, perhaps we should explain what do we mean by tafsir. What is, for example, the difference between tafsir and ta'wil, for example. both of these words are quite commonly used when it comes to interpreting and understanding the Qur'an. From a linguist's point of view, what's the meaning of tafsir? You're the only linguist here, so.
Interpretation.
From linguist's point of view, not terminology, not mustalahat, but from a linguist point of view, from logos point of view, from language point of view.
If you have a problematic issue, then if you want to do tafsir to it, you're going to explain what it means.
Okay. So, the root of the word, or the word itself, means to make something clear, or to make something plain, or to make something apparent, or to explain, or to expound, or to interpret something. In other words, with respect to we'll give a more concise definition of tafsir with respect to the terminology of the ulum al-Quran, or the science of the Quran. But basically it means to explain, such as explaining the meaning of the Quran. Well, another word that is often used is the word ta'wil. What's the meaning of the word ta'wil? We already heard from him. In English, yes, in English. Yeah. Ta'wil comes, what's the root of the word ta'wil? Where does it come from? So, wake up. لا, in Arabic, no. لا, because they refuse to give me. Which means what in English now? طيب.
Hidden meaning. The real meaning.
طيب. ta'wil actually has different meanings. And that's why some people are confused with respect to what is meant by ta'wil sometimes. And if, for example, if you read the Tafseer of Tabari, and after almost every verse he will say the ta'wil of this verse, or those people who say the ta'wil of this verse is such and such. What does he mean by ta'wil in that case? Ta'wil in that case, he means the explanation. He means the same thing as tafsir. And this is one of the meanings of ta'wil. But ta'wil also has another meaning. If we go to the Qur'an, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ جِئْنَاهُمْ بِكِتَابٍ فَصَلْنَاهُ عَلَى عَلْمٍ هُدًى وَرَحْمَةً لِقَوْمٍ يُؤْمِنُونَ هَلْ يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَّا تَأْوِيلَهُ. In this verse, I guess I should read it in English, but I don't have it here in English. In this verse, what's the meaning of ta'wil? No? Ta'wil also means when the thing actually occurs, or to implement something. And if you're talking about an order, for example, if I order you to do something, the ta'wil of that, if I give you an expression in Arabic which is in the form of insha, like an order, the ta'wil of that order is when you actually do it, and the actual implementation. Well, this is why Aisha, she said that the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to make ruku' and when he used to make sajda in the prayer, he used to make a certain dua, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, Allahumma ighfirli. Well, she said this is the ta'wil of a specific verse. In other words, this is the implementation, or the actualization, or the realization of that verse. So ta'wil has actually more than one meaning, and we'll come back to that. Yes, thank you. You can tell how well my notes are arranged. So I'm flipping back and forth here. Actually, what I did is these are 3 different things I wrote, and I tried to put them all together, and I don't know how well it's going to work out. The third meaning, or another meaning actually of ta'wil, is what?
Real meaning. ما له professional. ما له شيء. When you provide
what do you mean by the real meaning of the verse? Now you have me confused. The real meaning of the verse. The real meaning of the verse is the second meaning of ta'wil, and the actualization of something. That is the real meaning of a verse.
you are providing an explanation of the verse, you're not sure about the actual explanation. We're just giving it.
Okay, as I said, some of the confusion comes in because ta'wil is used in many different ways. One of the ways that it is used, which is a new definition or new meaning of ta'wil, which was not the way the Salaf used to use it. Actually, this whole discussion of what is the meaning of tafsir and ta'wil and what's the difference between them, which we'll get into, this whole discussion has developed because they noticed that some of the Salaf, sometimes they used to say tafsir, sometimes they used to say ta'wil. So someone thought of the question, well, what's the difference between them? Well, ever since that one person thought of it, everybody else has written about it. So there's many different opinions about it. But a newer meaning of ta'wil, which as I said, and it did not exist among the early generations in Islam, is that you take and you look at the literal meaning of something, or you look at something, the zahir meaning or the apparent meaning of a specific word, and you, instead of taking that apparent meaning, you take a meaning which is less as strong from a linguistic point of view. And in other words, instead of taking what the verse says, for example, and if the verse says something, it's clear, its meaning is clear, or the meaning is apparent, and you say, well, although that's what the verse says, and that would be the strongest meaning of the verse according to the language, I don't think that's the meaning of the verse. And you choose another meaning which is not as strong from a linguistic point of view. This is what the later scholars call ta'wil. Unfortunately, this is what led to lots of deviations in tafsir, because it was used as an excuse, or it was used as a way to avoid what the Qur'an is actually saying and to try to give some other meaning to it. Later inshallah we'll talk about ta'wil and what is considered by some an acceptable type of ta'wil and what is not considered an acceptable type of ta'wil. Yes. No. Thank you.
Can this be explicated in terms of the event in which Rasul told the people, like his companions, not to pray al-Asr except in Bani Qurayza? What did they do in ta'wil or tafsir? From the point of view of the language, there is some difference between ta'wil and tafsir. And as I said, some of the early scholars, they used to use the term tafsir, and some of them used to use the word ta'wil. So this led to the question is what is the difference between them, or is there any difference between them? Well, the answer to that question, the answer to that is what? No, the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, depending on what you mean by ta'wil, and no, depending on what you mean by ta'wil. Because as we said, Tabari used the term ta'wil to mean tafsir. So that's why some scholars, such as an early scholar called Abu Ubaid, he said there is no difference between tafsir and ta'wil. They are one and the same. Okay? Now, and it has this means in that case tafsir. Ta'wil al-ahlam is this is the understanding of what the thing is actually, how the thing is actually going to take place. The second meaning. Now, ta'wil means, if we take ta'wil, so the first opinion amongst some scholars is there's no difference between tafsir and ta'wil. And as we said, yes, that's correct, depending on how you define ta'wil. And as I said, if you go to Tabari's book, when he said the ta'wil of this verse, and the people who say the ta'wil of this verse is such and such, he is in fact using ta'wil in the same sense as tafsir. If ta'wil means the second meaning, the actual implementation of the verse, or the act itself that the verse is referring to, or the implementation of the command of the verse, then obviously there's a big difference between tafsir and ta'wil. In that case, there's really no relation between them. Tafsir is the explanation of a verse, while ta'wil is the actual application or appearance or implementation of a verse.
And that's the story of Al-Ansar, when one of them says,
I think. Now some scholars, especially in the later years, again, they try to distinguish between tafsir and ta'wil. So
some of them said that the tafsir is the explanation of something or a statement from something which is clear in the book of Allah or stated in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And basically you're just reiterating a statement which is clear and explicit. And ta'wil is something which is derived by the scholars. And in other words, ta'wil involves istinbat. Someone studies the verse and he tries to understand how to apply the verse, what's the meaning of the verse today, and so forth. This is what some scholars call ta'wil. While just giving the meaning of the verse or what was been said about the verse from the Prophet ﷺ or what the Sahaba is, they call this tafsir. So that's why you might read in some books, you'll read that tafsir is related to riwayah, or what has been passed on about the verse, while ta'wil is related to diraya, or the understanding and trying to derive rulings from the
Doesn't follow from English to Arabic. Riwayah and diraya. I was confused.
Tafsir is related to riwayah, or what has been narrated.
You said diraya, and you said what is diraya.
And another difference between them, according to some scholars, and again some later scholars, is that tafsir is to give the meaning of individual words, while ta'wil is to give the general or overall meaning of a sentence or verse. Well, finally, according to al-Maturidi, and founder of a large school of thought, and he said that tafsir is based on definitive knowledge and is an explicit declaration about the meaning of the verse, and it is a witness in front of Allah that this is exactly what Allah means. So he is narrowing down tafsir to only those things which for sure you can say for sure are correct. There's no doubt about them. They are qat'i. That's Arabic, qat'i. They are definitive. What ta'wil is if something is open to more than one meaning. Ta'wil is to derive which meaning is the proper meaning. So again, for him, ta'wil is more work of the mujtahid or of the scholar, while tafsir is basically something which is passed on. Well, as I said, all of these differences are related to the later generations. And if you go to the early generations, up until the time of Tabari, Tabari lived in which century? One of the early centuries. And he lived between the 3rd and the 4th century. From like 290 to 360, around that period. Up until that time, as I said, ta'wil and tafsir, they meant basically the same thing with respect to ulum al-Qur'an. Well, from this opening discussion, we can then now give a definition of what we mean by tafsir. One of the best definitions given, and he also explained his definition very well, is given by Abu Hayyan, the linguist, but also the commentator on the Qur'an. He said that tafsir is the science that studies how to state the words of the Qur'an. So he's saying it involves also al-qira'at, or the different readings of the Qur'an, and what such words imply. In other words, from the language point of view, local point of view, and their individual and compound rulings. Under this topic he included, for example, al-i'rab, tasrif, and these things related to language, and their meanings from the combination of the words. Not just the words individually, but also when you put them together, their meanings. And what he means by this, as he stated in his own explanation, is what has to be taken in the form of majaz, and what is to be taken in the form of in the form of allegorical sense, and what has to be taken in the form of literal sense. Allegorical, majaz, not literal. And finally he said, and what is needed to complete that. In other words, as he explained it, the knowledge of abrogated and abrogated, nasakh wal mansukh, the knowledge of the asbab al-nuzul, or the circumstances surrounding the revelation of different verses. All of these things are part and parcel of tafsir. In other words, if you really want to know, basically what he's saying here is that if you really want to know how to derive the meaning of the Qur'an from the verse of the Qur'an, you actually have to be familiar with all of these things. Well, all of these things are covered by the science of tafsir. Well, inshallah, before I get into that and get into the and the way to make tafsir and what is the methodology of tafsir, which and inshallah we'll cover part of that today. I want to just discuss a little bit about the importance of proper tafsir. And the importance of proper tafsir. Well, actually, this is something I think everyone should be familiar with, but I just want to give it emphasis and discuss some points related to it. In other words, these are really introductory points to the topic of tafsir, and you will probably not, if you pick up a book on ulum tafsir or a book about tafsir, you will probably not find all of these things in that book. And as we all know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed the Qur'an as a guidance for mankind, as a guidance and as a mercy. Well, in order for us to gain that guidance, in order for us to really know what is the straight path that the Qur'an is referring to, or the Qur'an is leading us to, and we have to know how to go to the Qur'an, and we have to know how to understand the Qur'an. And this is essential, because even if we read the Qur'an and we believe in the Qur'an, but we don't know how to understand the Qur'an, then no matter how much we believe in the Qur'an and we want to follow the Qur'an, our conclusions from our reading of the Qur'an will not be correct. And even if we have the right intention, if we do not go to the Qur'an and be able to understand the Qur'an properly, in the proper manner, then the Qur'an will be guiding to one path, while ourselves will be following a different path. Well, maybe in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we have the right intention, and we didn't know about principles of tafsir and how important it is to have the proper tafsir, and maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive us. But even if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives us, we will still be missing that path in this world that we wish that we could follow. Well, many times people get the wrong conclusions from the Qur'an, from reading the Qur'an, and the basic reason for that is because of some lacking in methodology, some lacking in knowledge, some lacking in background. For example, those people who are ignorant of the rules of the Arabic language, those people who rely on translation. Many people, they pick up the translation of Yusuf Ali, hopefully non-Arabs, and they don't know Arabic, and they're relying on the translation, and they begin to interpret the Qur'an based on the translation. Well, this is something very, very dangerous, because the translation cannot keep. I just finished reviewing a new translation of the Qur'an, and it is almost impossible because of the differences in languages. It is impossible for the translation to keep the same kind of rules of language as are found in the Arabic original. Well, also it is not possible for the words that you use to translate the Qur'an to have all of the same meanings that the original word had in Arabic. So it is not possible to rely on translation to try to interpret the Qur'an. And similarly, someone who is not very strong in the Arabic language, also it will not be possible for him to get the proper meaning from the Qur'an. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there's other sciences which are related to it that you also have to be familiar with. And it's not just being a linguist that won't be sufficient. And you have to know also other things. For example, many of the verses in the Qur'an, their meanings are not clear just from the wording of the verse, but they are also related to things that occurred at that time, the asbab al-nuzul. Sometimes when you know the asbab al-nuzul, as an example you mentioned of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, sometimes when you know the asbab al-nuzul, it completely changes actually your understanding of what the verse really is all about. For example, my English doesn't have the ayn in this. The Uthman ibn Mad'un, okay? Uthman ibn Mad'un, which was, from what generation was he from? He was from the Sahaba, right? And he was of the opinion that it is halal to drink alcohol. and it is halal for Muslims to drink alcohol. Well, where did he get that from? No? لا. Another verse. طيب. And he derived this ruling from a verse in the Qur'an which says ليس على الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات جناح فيما طعموا إذا ما اتقوا وآمنوا وعملوا الصالحات ثم اتقوا وآمنوا ثم اتقوا وأحسنوا والله يحب المحسنين. And there shall be no sin on those who believe and do good deeds for what they have eaten, and the rest of the rest of the verse. And he simply, and if you read that verse, it means that no matter what you eat, and you could understand from that verse, right? That as long as you believe and do good deeds and you're pious, no matter what you eat, and there's no sin upon it. And in later generations, by the way, and this example comes from the time of the Sahaba, in later generations, some of the Sufis commentating on the Qur'an also, they said that this is one of the verses that proves that if you're from the awliya, or the devoted servants of Allah, and from the muhsineen, those people who do good, the laws of the Sharia, there's no sin on you no matter what you do. What was the mistake of Rahman in interpreting this verse? What part? He was unfortunately not aware of the asbab al-nuzul of this verse. And what was the context in which this verse was revealed. If he was aware of it, obviously he would not have made that statement. Because this verse was revealed in what context?
And people in Sahaba were killed before ayat al-khamr.
No. And there were people, after alcohol was prohibited, some of the Sahaba came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and they asked the Prophet ﷺ about those people who used to drink, those believers who died before that verse was revealed, and they used to drink alcohol. What about them? Well, that is when this verse was revealed.
The Jews came.
The Sahaba. Well, according to what is recorded in Ahmed and Nasai, it was the Sahaba who came and asked about those people who have been killed fi sabilillah, and yet they had drank alcohol.
The Sahaba asked but the Jews initiated this.
هذا possible, but it's not mentioned in Ahmed and Nasai, but it is possible. Then Allah revealed this verse, saying that what they did at that time, there's no sin upon them for what they did. Well, actually, Umar ibn Khattab and actually Ibn Abbas, he understood this concept very well, because Umar ibn Khattab one time, he was wondering why the Muslim Ummah was split into different groups, while their Qibla is one, and their Prophet was one, and their book is one. So he sent for Ibn Abbas and he asked him about this. So Ibn Abbas stated to Umar ibn Khattab, "O Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Qur'an has been revealed to us, and we recite it, and we know about what it has been revealed. After us there will be a people who will recite the Qur'an, but not know the context that it has been revealed. Therefore they will use their opinions, and to interpret the Qur'an, and when they resort to their opinions, they will differ among themselves, and they will fight each other." Well, this statement of Ibn Abbas, and he shows that the Qur'an clearly could be leading or guiding to one thing, but because of our shortcoming, our lack of proper understanding of how to derive the meanings of the Qur'an, we in fact will not only miss the true guidance of the Qur'an, but as Ibn Abbas stated, even more than that, we will differ among us, and when we differ among us, we will even begin to fight. Well, this is of course if the person has the right intention, and he has the right intention to know what is stated in the Qur'an, but because he is lacking in following the proper methodology, he will not find exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants or means from the Qur'an. Well, even worse than that, which we see in the history, it seems, what we see in the history is people making the ta'wil that we talked about before, interpreting the Qur'an in such a way which is inconsistent with its apparent meaning. And one of the things that can lead to that is if someone already has his mind made up about what is true and what is false, and therefore he goes to the Qur'an not with an open mind to get the guidance of the Qur'an, but he goes to the Qur'an with his mind already made up about what is true, what is false. And if he comes across something in the Qur'an that goes against his belief, he'll try to make some kind of ta'wil or some kind of some kind of interpretation that will make that consistent with his belief. And an example of that, which is related to both, by the way, both hadith and the Qur'an, because the principles, by the way, of understanding hadith, understanding what the Prophet ﷺ said in many cases, and tafsir al-nusus, or how to understand the wording, is pretty much is the same with respect to the Qur'an as with respect to the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he said that his intercession, you all know intercession, and his shafa'ah on the Day of Judgment will be for whom? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ will intercede for whom on the Day of Judgment? Yeah, what did I say?
Allah.
I meant Prophet ﷺ. Well, in general, the Prophet ﷺ, there's actually many hadith. That's not a good question because there are many different hadith that talk about who he will intercede for. But in one of the hadith he said that I will intercede for Ahl al-Kabair. Ahl al-Kabair. What's the meaning of Ahl al-Kabair? The believers who committed great sins. They are still believers, but they committed the great sins. Well, there's some people who don't believe, first of all, in intercession of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and they reject this concept. And there's another group of people who don't believe that if you commit al-kabair, that you will be taken out of the hellfire, and that you will actually, even the people who commit the kabair, they will stay in the hellfire forever. One example of how people can make their beliefs determine their conclusion. Their conclusion about Ahl al-Kabair, who are these people mentioned in this hadith? They said Ahl al-Kabair are the people who have patience and pray. Well, how did they get this? Now, they said that Ahl al-Kabair are the people of sabr wa salat. And their proof is وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ وَإِنَّهَا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ. So they are, the verse means in English, seek help and patience and prayer, and truly it is hard, or it is difficult to say for the humble-minded. Well, they are completely distorting the meaning of this verse, from a language point of view. They are saying that this verse, in which it says it is a kabira ila al-khashi'in, they are saying that these are the Ahl al-Kabair, those people who have salat, who make the salat and have sabr. Well, even worse than that is that even in verses in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself explicitly explained the meaning, and mentioned the verse and said what the verse meant, even sometimes in these cases there are people who refuse to follow what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, because it goes against their own beliefs, and so therefore they try to make this kind of ta'wil or interpretation to make the verse more in line with what they believe. One example of that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, لِلَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا الْحُسْنَى وَالزِّيَادَةِ. Well, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in a long hadith, I will not read the whole hadith, but talking about the Jannah wa Ahl al-Jannah, the people in paradise, the Prophet ﷺ explained as ziyada, or the verse says, for those who do good is the best reward and more. That's the way that it's usually translated. You're supposed to remind me to say things in English. The Prophet ﷺ explained the more, or ziyada, as what? Seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are some people who don't accept the idea of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. So one of them, and learning from the Aqlaniyya states, I'll not mention who he is. One of them, he explained this verse, what he said about more, in his tafsir of this verse. Instead of saying that ziyada means seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet ﷺ explicitly explained, he said that more means that they'll be given more than what they actually deserve. Al-husna wa ziyada, they'll be given the good and more than what they actually deserve. And these few examples show us the importance of the science of tafsir and of properly interpreting the Qur'an. And it's not just the case that just because we are believers that we say that we believe in the Qur'an. And Islam is not an existential religion where everyone can go to the Qur'an and get his own meaning from the Qur'an and that's the truth for him, regardless. And actually the Qur'an has a specific meaning, and we'll talk about later, inshallah, how to derive that specific meaning. Now, before we go on again, still introductory points about the methodology of tafsir, and I want to talk some more about this concept, especially because we hear it a lot in the United States, and also, when we used to have, for example, tafsir, we used to have tafsir once a week in the city, in the mosque that I used to be in, and many times I heard this statement from many brothers. And that is the statement that I alluded to earlier, and that is that each and every Muslim should be able to go to the Qur'an and understand the Qur'an and interpret the Qur'an, and in the way that his heart tells him. Well, as I said, we hear this a lot in the United States, and the reason you hear it in particular in the United States among converts to Islam, if they came from a Christian background, this is one of the beliefs in Christianity. And that the revelation has different meaning to everyone, and everyone should go to the revelation and read it with an open heart and get their meaning from it. Well, unfortunately, for some people, this unfortunately for some Muslims, sometimes this kind of lingers with them, that they believe that any Muslim, any believer who has a pure heart, he should be able to go to the Qur'an and explain the Qur'an and according to his heart. Well, of course, if that is the case, then there would be no need whatsoever for the science of tafsir. We'd just be wasting our time here. But in fact, there's many, we could, just briefly, we could mention some of the reasons why there is need for tafsir, even for people, for example, who are Arabs and so forth. One reason why we need the science of tafsir, why the Qur'an, in order for us to understand the Qur'an, we need the science of tafsir. One reason is that the language of the Qur'an is the most eloquent and is the most concise and articulate language of the Arabic language. Well, not every Arab, and especially not every non-Arab, has the ability, from a linguistic point of view or from a language point of view, to understand all the small points, the small details from just reading the Qur'an. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, some of the surrounding events or references that the Qur'an is talking about are not mentioned in the Qur'an itself, especially with respect to the practices of the Arabs during the time of Jahiliyyah. And you'll find in the Qur'an sometimes many references to them. Unless you're familiar with what it is talking about, you'll not be able to know what the Qur'an means. Well, thirdly, some of the words or sentences in the Qur'an may have more than one possible meaning, and you have to be able to figure out what is the proper meaning from using the principles of tafsir. So the problem. Sure. Actually, I have some more here, but you may add one more. Going back to the point I made about saying that we are believers, so therefore we should be able and free to use our heart to understand the Quran. And this is actually, if you're just taking the Quran and trying to say this is the meaning of the Quran without basing it on any methodology, without basing it on proper ilm, this is actually very dangerous, because first of all, since you don't have any methodology, you don't have any proof basically for your interpretation of the Quran, and your interpretation of the Quran can come from different sources. And it could be a kind of inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is possible. But it could also come from a shaitan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us in the Quran that when we recite the Qur'an, to seek refuge from the shaitan. And one of the reasons for that, as the ulama have discussed, is especially when we read the Qur'an, the shaitan is going to try to come to us and confuse us and mislead us and take us away from the true meaning of the Qur'an. So when you just interpret the Qur'an according to your heart, or you don't have to say according to your heart, but basically without basing it on real knowledge, and you have no way of knowing whether that in fact was a kind of inspiration from Allah, or whether it's from a shaitan, or whether it's from your own desires, your own lust, your own hawa. And there's no way to know which one actually that interpretation came from that you made. And there's many verses in the Qur'an, there's many statements of the Sahaba, and they talk about this kind of aspect of interpreting the Qur'an based on without knowledge, without, in other words, the proper method of tafsir. Basically, when we say you're interpreting the Qur'an without knowledge, basically we're saying without the proper methodology and without the proper sources of tafsir. Well, Al-Qurtubi in his tafsir of the Qur'an, actually he talks about such people, who say that when they read the Qur'an, that in my mind this comes to mind, or my heart says to me, and so forth. And in fact he concludes that anyone who reads the Qur'an and says, ask your heart, or my heart says to me, and so forth, and they are speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without ilm, which is, as we'll talk about, one of the greatest sins that we could commit. And he said they are actually from the Zanadiqa, or those people who have nothing to do with Islam, and he said they should be killed as apostates. When you go to the Qur'an and you read a verse of the Qur'an and you explain that verse of the Qur'an without having the proper knowledge and without following the proper methodology, you are actually, and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, you might be following your own hawa, your own desires. You might be following an inspiration from the shaitan. You might be following or conjecture, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in many places in the Qur'an. Or it might actually be some kind of inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but most likely it is not the last case. And why is it not the last case? Because, as we'll talk about later, you did not follow the proper methodology of talking about the Qur'an. Well, if you do not follow the proper methodology of talking about the Qur'an, then you have committed a sin already. And by talking about the Qur'an without the proper knowledge, and by giving interpretation of the Qur'an without the proper knowledge, without the proper background, without being qualified to do so, then you've already committed a sin. So since you are committing a sin, it's very unlikely, in most cases, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless you through that sin to give you the right interpretation of the Qur'an. Well, with respect to speaking, as I said, when you say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means this, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means that, by in a specific verse, you are actually speaking or saying something on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are actually speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you are speaking without knowledge, without ilm, this is one of the greatest sins that you could commit. In fact, Ibn al-Qayyim says that it is the greatest sin. Ibn al-Qayyim said that speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without ilm is the greatest sin that you could commit. He bases it on this verse. قُلْ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّيَ الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ وَالْإِثْمَ وَالْبَغْيَ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ وَأَن تُشْرِكُوا بِاللَّهِ مَا لَمْ يُنَزِّلْ بِهِ سُلْطَانًا وَأَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Well, in discussing this verse, he says, first of all, that there are some sins which are haram lidatihi, haram, or they are forbidden because of their own evilness. Let's put it that way, a loose translation. Or haram lighayrihi, which are forbidden because they lead to something evil, or they have some evil in them. Well, he said with respect to these, the verse in English, the verse, that verse that I read in English said, say the things that my Lord has indeed forbidden are indecent deeds, whether open or secret, sins and trespasses against truth, assigning a partner to Allah for which He has given no authority, and saying things about Allah of which you have no knowledge. Well, he said about all of these four, yani they are haram lidati, yani they are haram in their own essence because of the evil in them. Continuing his discussion, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first mentions al-fawahisha, ma dhahara minha wa ma batan. Well, he says, yani this is the less of the sins that he mentions. But then he mentions sins and trespasses against truth. يعني الإثم والبغي بغير الحق. Well, this is the greater sin than the first one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. And then he mentioned يعني making shirk. Well, finally he mentioned saying things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of which you have no knowledge. And he said this last one, يعني he's saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually going from the lesser to the greater. And the reason he says that is because يعني this last sin of saying things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without ilm, which is actually what you do yani when you make tafsir without the proper background, without the proper methodology. And he says it involves and it includes many things, which yani many things even more than what committing shirk involves. He said it involves and includes ascribing something falsely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, changing or altering the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, denying what He has confirmed or confirming what He has denied, affirming something declared false or declaring something false as true. And it also includes supporting something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes or opposes, and liking something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes. And in other words, when you are speaking without ilm and in the religion, in things which are related to the religion, then in fact you are changing the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in fact, and if you continue reading what he wrote, this is by the way from Mudarij al-Salikin, volume 1, pages 372, 373. This is the unabridged edition. I don't know where it's in the abridged edition. And you will find that in fact speaking without ilm, the non-mukhtasar version, but speaking without ilm is actually the real source of all kufr and shirk. And he said, for example, the polytheists, they claim that what they're worshipping instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was something to take them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the cause of their shirk was saying something about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without ilm, something that they did not know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they're saying. Similar today, the greatest kufr that we have nowadays, and among Muslims, but especially among non-Muslims, is secularism, or al-ilmaniyya. And the basis for that is saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't really care about what we do in worldly affairs, or He hasn't given us guidance for worldly affairs, or the deen that He sent isn't meant for worldly affairs. And all of this is speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without Him. So in fact it is one of the greatest sins. Well, Ibn Qayyim even included that it is in fact the greatest sin. Also, he also mentions that every bid'ah, every innovation also is based on some statement that has no support from the Qur'an or Sunnah. In other words, every bid'ah also is based on some statement which is actually made without ilm.
Is it going as far as saying every bid'ah?
Well, to think about this point even further about just going to the Qur'an and saying I'm a believer, I am pious, I can go to the Qur'an and read the Qur'an and get its own meaning. And if there was any people in the history of mankind who could have said that, and maybe we could have accepted it from it, would be the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And for many reasons. And they witnessed the revelation of the Qur'an itself. And they witnessed the events that it was referring to. They were living the events that it was referring to. And the Qur'an was revealed in their language, and in the language of their time. Well, also the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose them to be the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and He described them as the best generation. So if anyone could actually make that claim, that he has such a pure heart and such a close relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or such a good understanding of Islam, that he can go to the Qur'an and interpret the Qur'an simply by what his heart tells him, or what they used to call a ra'i, and after the Sufis it became what their heart tells them, but originally it was called a ra'i, or personal opinion, and it would be the Sahaba. But if we go to the Sahaba, we see that what they understood and what they learned from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in fact, is the complete opposite. And what they learn is that it is absolutely forbidden to speak about the Qur'an without proper knowledge. And they make such statements. For example, Abu Bakr one time said, what earth would give me a place to live and what sky would shade me if I should speak about the Qur'an with my opinion or by something I do not know. Well, Umar ibn Khattab also, he said, beware of using your opinion in religious manners. Well, Ibn Abbas, the one who the Prophet ﷺ made dua for him to understand the Qur'an, to get the understanding of the deen and to be given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the ta'wil or the understanding of the Qur'an. He also said that all there is to follow and obey is the book of Allah and the sunnah of His Messenger. Whoever makes any statement after these two, according to his opinion, then I do not know if he will find it among his good deeds or among his sins. Well, this is the style of Ibn Abbas that he made in many statements. Meaning that even if what you did was something good, it looks like something good, it will be among, you will find it among your sins. Well, Tirmidhi, in his Sunan, he said it has been related from some of the people, Ahl al-Ilm, people of knowledge of the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, and others that they were very strict when it came to speaking about the Qur'an without ilm. Well, on this point, this is perhaps a footnote. In fact, here in my notes it is a footnote. On this point, perhaps I should mention two statements, which, Allah Alam, it seems that they are statements of the Sahaba. In fact, they are statements of Ibn Abbas, which many people state as hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And as hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, they are weak. They are not authenticated that the Prophet ﷺ said these, but it is authenticated that the Sahaba, and particularly Ibn Abbas, made these statements. The first statement says that whoever speaks about the Qur'an without knowledge shall take his seat in the hellfire. Another narration of the same hadith is whoever speaks about the Qur'an according to his opinion shall take his seat in the hellfire. Well, as I said, this hadith, and this one was recorded by Tirmidhi. It is a famous hadith, but in fact it is weak, and the stronger opinion is that it is a statement of one of the Sahaba. Well, similarly, another statement another hadith, another thing that is narrated as the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, says that whoever speaks about the Qur'an by his opinion, and even if what he said is correct, then he is still mistaken. This was recorded by Abu Dawud in Tirmidhi. That if you interpret the Qur'an according to your ra'i or your opinion, and even if your conclusion happens to be correct, you are mistaken because you didn't follow the proper method, you did not have the proper background and so forth to make that statement. Some scholars, such as Al-Tirmidhi and Al-Hakim and Al-Suyuti, they consider these hadith hasan, as hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But these three scholars in particular, they are not very exact, and they are known to be a little bit lax when it comes to saying that hadith are hasan as opposed to weak. Other scholars such as Ahmed wa Al-Bukhari wa Al-Manawi wa Al-Albani wa Shu'aib al-Arnaut, they say that these hadith are weak, and the strongest opinion among the scholars of hadith, in fact, are that they are not hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but they are in fact statements of different Sahaba. Well, this understanding of how important it is not to speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without ilm, and if the Sahaba passed it on to their students, the Tabi'een, and we can find also many statements from the Tabi'een and many examples from the Tabi'een, and in which they also would be very careful about what they say in Tafseer or in explaining the Qur'an. For example, Masruq said, be cautious when it comes to Tafseer as you are narrating something from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by saying Allah means this or Allah means that, you are actually narrating something from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, Sa'id ibn al-Mutayyib was asked about whenever he was asked about the Qur'an, and if the answer wasn't something clear in hadith of the Prophet ﷺ or that he learned from some of the Sahaba, he said, we do not say anything by our opinions when it comes to the Qur'an. Well, this introductory lecture, and especially the last part of this lecture, really has been meant to drive home the point that if we want really to know what the Qur'an means, and we want really to follow the path that the Qur'an is describing, and we don't just turn to the Qur'an without background, without first of all, of course, we have to have the proper intention. But even with the proper intention, we cannot just turn to the Quran and background and proper knowledge, and to understand how to derive the meanings of the Qur'an. And we have to be very careful about just reading the verse of the Qur'an and coming up with our own meaning. Well, and if we do not have the proper qualifications, and no one is free just to turn the Qur'an and interpret the Qur'an in any manner that he wishes. There is a certain science, there is a certain methodology, there are certain sources for tafsir, and we have to do our best to follow those. And inshallah, that's what the next lecture will be about. And what are some of the sources of tafsir, and we'll continue from there, inshallah. And spreading knowledge, passing on knowledge is different from speaking in the religion according to your own opinion. And what you mean by passing on knowledge is passing on something that you are sure about is correct, such as a verse of the Qur'an and hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and what the scholars said. And those people are qualified to make ijtihad and interpret the text. So when you pass on what you learn from the scholars, this is passing on knowledge. Nothing wrong with it. But then when you from yourself, if you're not a scholar, you don't have the proper background, and you go beyond your limits, then you get to the point, and if you start adding things from yourself and saying, well, this also means this and this, this is the thing that you have to avoid.
So almost have to refer to a scholar or something.
And well, you have to have some strong source for what you're saying, either a verse in the Quran or hadith or something. And there are actually two types of verses in the Quran. One which is clear by itself and actually doesn't really need any tafsir. Well, if you know Arabic language and you're proficient in Arabic language, and you will get the basic meaning of the verse. Nothing wrong with that. Some require more thinking about it.
Just saying this is the basic meaning, Brother said, would
and if you know that basic meaning is based on what you know from the Quran and from hadith and what scholars have said and your knowledge of the Arabic language, nothing wrong with it. The basic meaning. But even then, your basic meaning might be wrong. And for example, sometimes as I mentioned the Asbab al-Nuzul, if you know the context of the revelation, you'll find out that the meaning is completely different from what you understood from it. So what you understood from reading it, or from someone reading it, for example in the Salat, and this is something you have to do. It's going to come to you whether you want to or not. In fact, otherwise you're not concentrating in the Salat. But that's different from taking that meaning that you understood, without having the proper background and passing it on to other people and saying this is the meaning of that verse.
Okay, if a new Muslim came and asked me what Qul Huwallahu Ahad, for example, means, or Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, should I abstain from explaining what that means?
Do you feel that you have the proper background? You heard enough scholars explain the meaning of this verse? You've read enough to know what the verse means?
So to say, I know what that means.
Right. And also I'm sure you've heard khutbah, not me, but I'm sure you've heard some people explain it in the khutbahs,
so
maybe in tapes. You're not making your own opinion, you are basing it on what the scholars do. And as I mentioned in the lecture, there are actually more than that verses. There are many verses that describe the Quran as something mubin, something clear. And as I mentioned in the lecture, there are two types of verses in the Quran. One is the one that is clear by itself and actually doesn't need tafsir. If you are familiar with Arabic, if you're not familiar with Arabic, it's not clear. If you're familiar with Arabic, it's just clear by itself. And that in fact is a large number of the Quran. But the simple meaning of the Quran is different from extracting rules from the Quran. And you have to distinguish between those two. Because extracting rules from the Quran, and you can understand a sentence. For example, if I said a sentence to you in English, you may understand it. Okay. But you may not be able to extract everything that sentence implies. And if you're not familiar with, for example, grammar, and how exactly I use some words, and what that implies and what that doesn't imply, you may not be able to do that. But you'll understand the general meaning sometimes of the sentence that I stated. So there is some verses whose meaning are clear, and the general meaning. The specific meaning, or how exactly what does it mean and how does it apply and so forth, this is what needs some knowledge. Secondly, as I mentioned, there are some verses which are not clear in themselves, except for maybe for someone who is an expert in Arabic language and so forth. So therefore, especially in this day and age, long time away from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and some of the expressions in language, for example, have changed, and some of the words in the Qur'an, some people may not understand them completely. And thirdly, sometimes there are references to things, or sometimes there's asbab al-nuzul that affect the meaning of the verse. So, there's one level of understanding which is almost all the verse in the Qur'an. You can get one level of understanding, but to say that that's the real exact meaning of the verse, this requires some more knowledge, some more thought, and some methodology, and so forth that we'll discuss. And of course, if you are, especially if you are familiar with Arabic, when you read the Qur'an, you're going to get a meaning of the Qur'an. And if you just read about it and think about it. But there's a big difference between you having that meaning, and it comes to you while you read the Qur'an because you understand the words and the meaning, and it must come to you, and you claiming that your understanding is what Allah meant by that. There's a big difference between the two. And obviously when you hear any verse in the Qur'an read, you will get a meaning from it. Obviously, and you're supposed to. But to claim, that meaning you keep to yourself. But as soon as you explain that meaning and claim that that is the correct meaning, and that's what Allah meant by it, well, if you say that without studying the verse in more detail and seeing if there's a slab nuzul, or did the Prophet ﷺ explain it in such a way that it's different from the apparent meaning, that is the thing that is wrong.
That has to do with your intention.
And your intention and what you do with the meaning that you understood. If you keep it to yourself, as this is how you understand the Qur'an, and you do your best to apply it, and your intention is to do what is right, and you are correct. But when you make that your understanding of the Qur'an as what the Qur'an actually means, and even without studying the verse in more detail, and can you imagine listening to a verse, just for example, hearing it for the first time, and claiming that you understand everything that verse means and implies, and so forth? This is what people do when they say, this is what Allah meant by that. My heart tells me that this is what that verse means, and so forth. And to do that, to claim that this is the meaning of the verse, you have to follow proper methodology and have the proper source.